Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the University of Washington's 29th Annual Faculty Lecture. I'm Mark Emmert, President of the University, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this wonderful event. Tonight's speaker is Dr. James A. Banks, holder of the Russell F. Stark University Professorship in the College of Education and Director of the University's Center for Multicultural Education. His lecture is titled Democracy, Diversity, and Social Justice, Education in a Global Age. Dr. Banks is a leading voice in the field of multicultural education, an area of study that reflects society's highest vision and goals for itself in the 21st century. You'll hear tonight that he brings not only world-class scholarship to the matter, but also his own personal experiences of racial discrimination and of the slow progress brought in recent decades. Dr. Banks remembers well our own unenlightened past, but also he looks to the future with hope and optimism. In delivering this address tonight, Dr. Banks joins a select group of distinguished University of Washington faculty. Selection for this lecture is perhaps the highest honor our faculty members can bestow upon one of their own. The annual faculty lecture began in 1976 to help expose the work of the university's finest faculty to a wider audience. Each year, a faculty committee reviews nominations sent from across the campus, looks for peers whose works have made a significant impact on the profession, on their research, and most importantly, on the lives of their students. It could be said that Dr. Banks' time in public school as a teacher in the early 1960s prepared him well for his later work. He came to the University of Washington in 1969 after earning a bachelor's degree in elementary education and social science from Chicago State University, and then a master's and PhD degrees in the same field from Michigan State University. He was the first African-American hired as a faculty member of the university's College of Education and the first at the university to earn tenure. Back then, as now, Dr. Banks's work has fueled in part by some basic questions about race and ethnicity that he first posed at a young age and which have remained key to his research. It's a perspective to which we should attend closely, being a reminder both of how far we have come and how much remains to be done. Dr. Banks has written more than 100 journal articles and has written or edited 20 books. He developed the first courses to focus exclusively on ethnic and cultural diversity, founded the Center for Multicultural Education in 1992, and continues to serve as its director. Dr. Banks' vita reveals an impressive list of honors, awards, and accomplishments. He's a member of both the Board of Children, Youth, and Families of the National Research Council and is a past president of the National Council for the Society of Social Studies and the American Education Research Association, both of which groups later have honored him with awards for his distinguished career. Dr. Banks has long studied the thorny questions of who constructs the knowledge used as the building blocks for written history, and how the biographical journeys of researchers can affect their values, research questions, and the knowledge they construct. Thus, personal experience and worldview can affect the nature and tone of scholarly research. Dr. Banks postulates just as his own personal experiences and our own personal experiences inform our research and our ever-burning curiosity. Members of his own profession have referred to James Banks as one of the founders of multicultural education, and we are proud tonight to have him with us for this lecture, and prouder still to have him as a member of our faculty and university community. Please join me in welcoming tonight's lecturer, James A. Banks. Jim?
Thank you, Dr. Emmert, for the kind introduction. There is increasing diversity as well as an increasing recognition of diversity in nation states throughout the world. After World War II, large numbers of people immigrated from the former colonies in Asia, Africa, and the West Indies to the United Kingdom to improve their economic status. Since the 1960s, thousands of people from diverse language, cultural, racial, and religious groups have immigrated to nations such as Germany, France, and the Netherlands. Australia and Canada have also experienced increased diversity caused by immigrant groups seeking better economic opportunities. Nations that traditionally have been thought of as homogeneous, such as Japan and Sweden, now acknowledge their diversity. Although the population of the U.S. has been diverse since the founding period, its ethnic composition has changed dramatically since the Immigration Reform Act was passed in 1965. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, most immigrants to the U.S. came from Europe. Today, most come from nations in Asia and Latin America. A significant number also come from the West Indies and Africa. The U.S. is now experiencing its largest influx of immigrants since the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The U.S. Census projects that ethnic groups of color are ethnic minorities, and tonight I'm going to use those terms synonymously. If there was time, I could explain the difference. The census projects that ethnic groups of color or ethnic minorities will increase from 28% of the nation's population today to 50% in the year 2050. You may have heard that whites are becoming a minority. That is not true. Spread the good news. They are not becoming a minority. You hear that. How many of you have heard that? That is not true. At least by 2050, they'll still be half the population. And I think that I like to erase that misconception because I think it's very important that we learn at least something tonight. If you learn nothing else, if you learn nothing else, you've learned that whites will not become a minority, at least until after 2050. Racial, cultural, ethnic, and language and religious diversity is also increasing in the United States as well as in other nations. Increasing in the schools, that is. 40% of the students enrolled in U.S. schools are students of color. 40%. This percentage is increasing, primarily because of the increase of Mexican-American students. In some of the nation's largest cities, such as Chicago, Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., New York, and San Francisco, half or more of the public school students are students of color. 59% of the students in the Seattle school districts are ethnic minorities. In 2002, students of color made up 65% of the student population in the public schools of California, the nation's largest state. Language and religious diversity is also increasing in the nation's student population. About 20% of the U.S. school-aged population speak a language at home other than English. Immigrant students are the fastest growing population of U.S. public schools. The percentage of African Americans who are foreign born is also increasing. The census estimates that 8%, or 2.2 million of the African American population is foreign born. And that is really significant. In a recent article in the New York Times, it indicated that more blacks were coming to the U.S. since the period of the Middle Passage or the slave trade. And I think that's very significant. There's a wide racial and cultural gap, however, between teachers and students. While 40% of the nation's students are ethnic minorities, most of the nation's teachers are white and speak only English. White teachers make up about 86% of the nation's teachers. And the percentage of white teachers in the nation's schools will not change in the foreseeable future. The vast majority of the students enrolled in college and university programs that prepare teachers are white. The significant changes in the racial, ethnic, and language groups that make up the nation's populations creates a demographic imperative for educators to respond to diversity. Diversity offers both opportunities and challenges to our nation, to schools, and to teachers. Diversity enriches our nation, communities, classrooms, and schools. Individuals from many different groups have made and continue to make significant contributions to American society. Diversity also provides our society with many different and enriched ways to identify, describe, and solve social, economic, and political problems. Diversity also provides schools, colleges, and universities with an opportunity to educate students in an environment that reflects the reality of the nation and the world, and to teach students from diverse groups how to get along. A diverse school environment enables students from many different groups to engage in discussions to solve complex problems related to living in a multicultural nation and world. However, diversity also poses serious challenges to our nation, to schools, and to teachers. Research indicates that students come to school with many stereotypes, misconceptions, and negative attitudes toward outside groups. Here is an example from a study by two researchers. Carla, a 3-year-old child, is preparing for resting time. She picks up her cot and starts to move it to the other side of the classroom. The teacher asks what she's doing. "I need to move this," Carla explains. "Why?" the teacher asks. "Because I can't sleep next to a black," Carla says, pointing to Nicole, a 4-year-old black child on a cot nearby. "Blacks are stinky. I can't sit next to one." Stunned, the teacher, who is white, tells Carla to move her cot back and not to use hurting words. Without curriculum intervention by teachers, the racial attitudes and behaviors of children become more negative and harder to change as children grow older. Consequently, an important aim of multicultural education is to provide students with experiences and materials that will help them develop more positive attitudes and values and behaviors toward individuals from different groups. The wide gap between the academic achievements of students of color, such as African Americans and Mexican Americans, and whites, and group of Asian Americans, such as Chinese and Japanese Americans, is another important challenge in diverse schools into a multicultural society. I will discuss the academic achievement gap later in my presentation. During the last 3 decades, my work has focused on ways to reform schools so that they will increase the academic achievement of diverse groups and help all students develop democratic racial attitudes and a commitment to democracy and social justice. Education in a democratic society should help students acquire the knowledge, attitudes, and skills needed to become productive workers within society, as well as develop the commitment, attitudes, and skills to work to make our nation and the world just places in which to live and work. We should educate students to be effective citizens of both their nation and the world. An important goal of multicultural education is to improve race relations and to help all students apply the knowledge, attitudes, and skills needed to participate in cross-cultural interactions and in personal, social, and civic action that will help make our nation and world more democratic and just. The goal of multicultural education is to teach students to know, to care, and to act. I will return to these 3 goals later in my presentation. Multicultural education is as important for middle and high-income white suburban students as it is for students of color who live in the inner city. The story is told about a wealthy child near Hollywood from the short-changed children of suburbia. This story indicates why multiculturalism is needed by all of the nation's students. The story is told about a little girl in a school near Hollywood who was asked to write a composition about a poor family. The essay began, "This family was very poor. The mommy was poor, the daddy was poor, the brothers and sisters were poor, the maid was poor, the nurse was poor, the butler was poor, the cook was poor, and the chauffeur was poor." Multicultural education fosters the public good and the overarching goals of the United States. Multicultural education is trying to Americanize America and to help it to actualize its ideals that are stated in its founding documents, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. That is the essence of the Multicultural Education Project, which has brought the nation closer to the democratic ideals stated in its founding documents. School-based reforms are needed to help students learn how to live together in civic, moral, and just communities that respect and value the rights and cultural characteristics of all students. Such efforts are made more difficult because a large percentage of students attend single-race schools and because segregation often exists within racially and ethnically mixed schools that use tracking and special programs to meet the special needs of student groups. The average white child attends a school that is over 78% white. The average black child attends a school that is over 57% black. The average Hispanic child attends a school that is over 57% Hispanic. The average Asian child attends a school that is over 19% Asian. Segregation is very much a fact of school life in America. What have we learned in the last 3 decades about ways in which schools can be transformed in order to increase the academic achievement of students from diverse groups and improve race and ethnic relations? I have categorized the major research and scholarship that has been done over the last 30 years into 5 dimensions, which I call the dimensions of multicultural education. I summarized this research in a chapter in the Handbook of Research on Multicultural Education. Tonight, I will briefly describe each of these dimensions and some of the significant insights that have been gained from research, scholarship, and wisdom of practice. The 5 dimensions are content integration, the knowledge construction process, prejudice reduction, inequity pedagogy, and an empowering school culture. I will discuss each of these dimensions in turn. I will start with content integration. Content integration deals with the extent to which teachers use examples and content from a variety of cultures in their teaching. Research indicates that when teachers include examples of content from different racial and ethnic groups, students develop more positive racial attitudes toward these groups, and their stereotypes of other groups are challenged. Research also indicates that students become more engaged and active learners when teachers incorporate information about their cultures, histories, and experiences into the curriculum. The next dimension I will discuss is the knowledge construction process. This process describes the extent to which teachers help students understand, investigate, and determine how the cultural assumptions, frames of reference, perspectives, and biases within a discipline influence the ways in which knowledge is constructed within it. Scholarship in ethnic studies and women's studies indicates that knowledge in the popular culture, in the media, and in textbooks reflects the biographies, perspectives, and cultural experiences of the scientists, social scientists, and historians who created that knowledge. The knowledge in the school curriculum and within textbooks has a powerful influence on how students view and experience the world. I will give an example from the textbooks that I used in school in the 1950s. I was an elementary school student in the Arkansas Delta in the 1950s. One of my most powerful memories of my school days is the image of the happy and loyal slaves in my social studies textbooks. I also remember that there were 3 other blacks in my social studies textbooks: Booker T. Washington, the educator; George Washington Carver, the scientist; and Marian Anderson, the classical singer. I had several persistent questions throughout my school days. Why were the slaves pictured as happy? Were there other blacks in history besides the 2 Washingtons and Anderson? Who created this image of slaves? Why? The image of the happy slaves was inconsistent with everything I knew about the African American descendants of enslaved people in my segregated community. We had to drink water from fountains labeled colored, and we could not use the city's public library. But we were not happy about either of these legal requirements. In fact, we resisted these laws in powerful but subtle ways each day. As children, we savored the taste of white water when the authorities were preoccupied with more serious infractions against the racial caste system. The civil rights movement that emerged in the 1960s, which consisted of marches and protests, contradicted the notion that African Americans in the South were happy with their condition. Throughout my schooling, these questions remained cogent as I tried to reconcile the presentations of African Americans in textbooks with the people I knew in my family and community. I wanted to know why these images were highly divergent. My epistemological quest to find out why the slaves were represented as happy became a lifelong journey that continues. And the closer I think I am to the answer, the more difficult and complex both my question and the answers become. The question, why were the slaves represented as happy, has taken different forms in various periods of my life, such as, why did a book like The Bell Curve, which argues that blacks are genetically inferior to whites, remain on the New York Times bestseller list for many weeks? I now believe, along with scholars such as Sandra Harding, Lorraine Code, Patricia Hill Collins, and Matthew Jacobson, that the biographical journeys of researchers greatly influence their values, their research questions, and the knowledge they construct. The knowledge they construct mirrors their life experiences and their values. I discovered through historical research that the paradigm of the happy slaves was constructed by Ulrich B. Phillips and described in his 1918 book, American Negro Slavery. Phillips, who was a descendant of slave owners, emphasized the benign treatment of the slaves and their happiness. The Phillips slavery paradigms was institutionalized in the popular culture and in schools, colleges, and universities. It was not seriously challenged by mainstream historians until the mid-1950s, the 1960s, and the 1970s by historians such as Kenneth Stamp, Stanley Elkins, and John Blassingame. However, the Phillips slavery paradigm was challenged from the academic margins and by African American scholars such as Carter G. Woodson and W.E.B. Du Bois when American Negro Slavery was first published in 1918. The next dimension I will discuss is inequity pedagogy. Inequity pedagogy exists when teachers modify their teaching in ways that will facilitate the academic achievement of students from diverse racial, cultural, gender, and social class groups. Culturally responsive teaching, a form of equity pedagogy, is used to help close the achievement gap. Many explanations have been given for the achievement gap. Multicultural education and theories believe that the difference between the home cultures of minority students and the school culture is a major reason for the low academic achievement of minority students. During the last 3 decades, researchers have been investigating ways in which teachers can make use of elements from the cultures of students to increase their academic achievement. Researchers have described ways in which the languages, dialects, and home cultures of low-income students and students of color can be used to motivate them to learn. Many studies describe the difference between the home culture and the school culture and describe ways in which teachers can build up on the home culture to enhance achievement. Researchers have described the ways in which verbal interactions differ in the school and in the homes of Navajo students, and how language use among white middle-class teachers, the white working class, and the black working class differs. Some researchers have described how teachers can use the home language of low-income African-American students, which is called Black English, as a vehicle to help them master standard English. Many of you will recall the contentious debate over Black English that occurred in the Oakland Public Schools in 1996, when the district proposed using Black English as a vehicle to teach African-American students standard English. This recommendation is quite consistent with research by linguists. Research indicates that an effective way to teach students a second language is to build upon their home language or dialect rather than try to eradicate it. Some studies provide evidence to support the idea that when teachers use culturally responsive teaching, the academic achievement of minority students increase. Professor Catherine Au at the University of Hawaii found that if teachers used participation structures in lessons that were similar to the Hawaiian speech event Talk Story, the reading achievement of Native Hawaiian students increased significantly. The chief characteristic of Talk Story is joint performance, or the cooperative production of responses of 2 or more speakers. For example, if the subject is going surfing, one of the boys begins by recounting the events of a particular day, but he will immediately invite one of the other boys to join in and to help to describe the events. The 2 boys will alternate as speakers, each telling part of the story, with other children occasionally chiming in. Talk Story is very different from recitations in most classrooms, in which the teacher usually calls on an individual child to tell a story. Professor Carol Lee at Northwestern University has found that the achievement of African American students increases when they are taught literary interpretations with lessons that use the African American verbal practice of signifying. Signifying is a genre within African American speech that involves ritual insult, such as playing the dozen. And many of you will know what I'm talking about. And the rest of you, I can tell you during the reception what signifying is about and playing the dozen is about. Signifying also involves a high use of figurative language. Professor Shirley Bryce Heath at Stanford University discovered that African American children in a Southern community would not answer questions that they felt that the teacher knew the answer to. They felt, why answer that question? For example, the teacher would ask, what color is this dish? And how many fingers do I have? And they wouldn't answer. They said, she knows the answer to that question. Well, what happened? Because they wouldn't answer the question, the teacher thought they weren't intelligent. But they didn't answer the question because they thought it was silly. Because in their culture, people only asked authentic questions when they really wanted to know the answer. So that what Shirley Heath has tried to do is try to help teachers draw upon the cultural frames of these kids in order to increase their academic achievement. You know, it's not unreasonable to assume, why answer a question if the person knows the answer? It's not quite unreasonable, not very unreasonable. The next dimension is prejudice reduction. This dimension focuses on the characteristics of students' racial attitudes and how they can be modified by teaching methods and materials. Research indicates that the use of multicultural textbooks, other teaching materials, and cooperative teaching strategies that enable students from different racial groups to interact positively in equal status situations help students develop democratic racial attitudes. These kinds of materials and teaching strategies can also result in students choosing more friends from outside racial, ethnic, and cultural groups. Since the 1940s, a number of curriculum intervention studies have been conducted to determine the effects of teaching units in lessons, multicultural textbooks and material, role-playing, and other kinds of simulated experiences on the racial attitudes and perceptions of students. These studies indicate that curriculum materials and interventions can help students develop positive racial attitudes and perceptions. These studies provide guidelines that can help teachers improve intergroup relations in their classrooms and schools when they have students such as Carla, that I referred to earlier, with the cot, if you remember that anecdote. And that's from a real study, by the way. It wasn't contrived. One of the earliest curriculum studies was conducted in 1952, called They Learn What They Live. It examined the effects of a democratic multicultural curriculum on the racial attitudes of children in the first and second grades. The curriculum had a positive effect on the attitudes of both the students and the teachers. And what the studies indicate that in order for students to learn democracy, they must experience a democratic curriculum in a democratic classrooms. Research indicates that when schools create superordinate groups, and that is groups with which members of all the groups in a situation identify, relations can be improved. When membership in a subordinate group is salient, other groups' differences become less important. Creating superordinate groups stimulates liking and cohesion, which can mitigate pre-existing animosities. An example of a superordinate group is a basketball team that includes Black, white, and Mexican-American students who are working together to beat an opponent. In this situation, race and ethnicity become less important than beating the opponent. The next dimension I will discuss is an empowering school culture. An empowering school culture is used to describe the process of restructuring the culture and organization of the school so that students from diverse groups will experience educational equality and cultural empowerment. Research and theory indicate that creating a successful school for low-income students and students of color requires restructuring the culture and organization of the school. Research indicates that the culture of some schools fosters high academic achievement and that the culture of other schools does not. And a very important point I'd like to make is that some of the effective schools are in inner cities and some are in suburbs. It doesn't mean because a school is in an inner city, it's not effective in raising achievement. So a school with an effective achievement culture can be in an inner city, low-income district, or it can be in the suburbs and vice versa. The key is the cultural characteristics of the school. Researchers call these effective schools effective or improving schools. What are some of their characteristics? This research has been done over a period of 30 years. What are some of the characteristics of an effective school? And I'll just list a few. First, safe and orderly environment. Secondly, a shared faculty commitment to improve achievement. An orientation focused on identifying and solving problems. High faculty cohesion and collaboration. In other words, teachers have to be professionals. High faculty input in decision making. Now, think about the high stakes test. To what extent are teachers involved in determining testing in their schools? Teachers need to be involved if we're going to have an effective school. And finally, in an effective school, there's a school-wide emphasis on recognizing positive performance and high academic achievement. Because we live in a global society that is highly interconnected, an effective education for the 21st century prepares students for thoughtful citizenship in their communities, the nation, and the world. Worldwide immigration and globalization raises new questions about how to prepare students for thoughtful and active citizenship. Multicultural societies are faced with the problem of constructing nation states that reflect and incorporate the diversity of its citizens, and yet have an overarching set of shared values, ideals, and goals to which all of its citizens are committed. Diversity and unity must be balanced in multicultural nation states. Only when a nation state is unified around a set of democratic values, such as justice and equality, can it protect the rights of cultural, ethnic, and language groups and enable them to experience cultural democracy and freedom. In a democratic society, ethnic and immigrant groups should have the right to maintain their ethnic cultures and languages, as well as participate in the national civic culture. The Canadian political theorist Will Kimlicka calls this concept multicultural citizenship. In 1924, Horace Kallen called it cultural democracy. And indeed, the term cultural democracy has been rediscovered and reinvented and is a very important concept for our field today. We believe that along with political democracy, we must also have cultural democracy. An assimilationist conception of citizenship education existed in most Western democratic nation states prior to the rise of the ethnic revitalization movements in the 60s and 70s. A major goal of citizenship education in these nations was to create a nation state in which all groups shared one dominant mainstream culture. It was assumed that ethnic and immigrant groups would forsake their original cultures in order to become full citizens of the nation state. Nationalists and assimilationists throughout the world worry that if they allow students to maintain identification with their cultural communities, they will not acquire sufficiently strong attachments to their nation states. Nationalists and assimilationists have a zero-sum concept of identity. The theoretical and empirical work of multicultural scholars indicates that identity is multiple, changing, overlapping, and contextual, rather than fixed and static, and that thoughtful and clarified cultural identifications will enable people to be more thoughtful, reflective, and active citizens of the civic community. Balancing unity and diversity is a continuing challenge for multicultural nation states. Unity without diversity results in hegemony and oppression. Diversity without unity leads to balkanization and the fracturing of the nation state. A major problem facing the nation state is how to recognize and legitimize difference and yet construct an overarching national identity that incorporates the values, experiences, hopes, and dreams of the diverse groups that compose it. A simulationist notion of citizenship are ineffective today because of the deepening diversity throughout the world and the quest by marginalized groups for cultural recognition and rights. Multicultural citizenship is essential for today's global age. It recognizes and legitimizes the right and needs of citizens to maintain commitments both to their cultural communities and to the national civic culture. Martha Nussbaum states that we should help students develop cosmopolitanism. Cosmopolitans view themselves as citizens of the world. Nussbaum states that their allegiance is to the worldwide community of human beings. Cosmopolitans are ready to immerse themselves in other cultures, engage with difference, and acquire cultural capital. Nussbaum contrasts cosmopolitan universalism and internationalism with parochial ethnocentrism and inward-looking patriotism. Students should develop a delicate balance of cultural, national, and global identifications. Cultural, national, and global experiences and identifications are interactive and interrelated in a dynamic way. Each needs to be developed in the schools. Teachers need to help students develop cultural and national identifications that are critical and thoughtful. Nationalism and national attachments in most nations are strong and tenacious. An important aim of citizenship education should be to help students develop global identifications. The ways in which people are moving back and forth across national borders challenge the notion of educating citizens to function in one nation state. Many people have more than one national identity and live in multiple places. Students also need to develop a deep understanding of the need to take action as citizens of the global community to help solve the world's difficult global problems. A goal of multicultural citizenship education is to teach students to know, to care, and to act. In order to increase social justice in their communities, the nation, and the world. I will discuss each of these goals in turn, teaching students to know, to care, and to act. First, to know. When we teach students to know, we help them acquire deep knowledge and understanding about the various groups within the United States and the world. We also help them to understand concepts and events from the perspectives of different groups and from the perspectives of men and women. When we teach students to view events and concepts from diverse perspectives, we are using what Bell Hooks calls a pedagogy of freedom, which helps students to view the nation and the world beyond their cultural borders and perspectives. When we are helping students to gain diverse perspectives on the nation and the world, it is important for them to view events from the perspectives and experiences of groups that have been neglected in the popular culture and in the schools. For example, we need to put the voices of women into the curriculum when it is being transformed. They have been as absent from Black and brown history as they have been from white history. Ella Baker, Fannie Lou Hamer, and Daisy Bates are examples of African American women who've been largely neglected in civil rights history and in the popular culture. Students learn about men in the civil rights movement, such as Martin Luther King and Jesse Jackson, but very little about women in the civil rights movement, such as Daisy Bates and Fannie Lou Hamer. Baker practically ran the day-to-day operations of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference behind the scenes. However, the men in SCLC, such as Andrew Young and Ralph Abernathy, get most of the credit and visibility in history books. Bringing the voices of women to school history helps students gain new perspectives on the American experience. An example is the story of Rosa Parks. We learn in the popular culture and in many textbooks that Parks did not give up her seat to a white writer because she was tired. However, Parks writes in her book with Jim Haskin, Rosa Parks, My Story, and I quote, "People always say that I didn't give up my seat because I was tired, but that isn't true. I was not tired physically. I'm no more tired than I usually was at the end of a working day. I was not old, although some people have an image of me of being old then. I was 42. No, the only tired I was tired of giving in." The multicultural curriculum also helps students to rethink and to examine taken for granted concepts such as the New World wasn't new to the Native Americans. They had been here for 30,000 years. The European discovery of America. Pioneers. Ask your neighbor, what would a Lakota Sioux call a pioneer? Ask your neighbor. Well, you can do it at the reception. Think of what would a Lakota Sioux call the pioneer? What would a Lakota Sioux call the settler? What would a Lakota Sioux call the westward movement? What about manifest destiny? What about American exceptionalism? The westward movement had very different meanings for different groups. For the Mexicans, it was north. For the Alaskans, it was south. For the Japanese, it was east. It was the center of the universe for the Lakota Sioux. Writes historian Patricia Nelson Limerick, and I quote, "The Mexicans came north. The Chinese and Japanese came east. The Alaskans went south. The Native Americans tried hard to stay put. They fought to stay where they were. They did not want to move." End of quote. The more perspectives that students learn, the better they will understand our nation and world. To know, to care, and to act. We also have to teach, once students know, they have to care. Education is a moral endeavor. We should educate both the hearts and minds of students and teach them to care. Horace Mann said to the graduates in his commencement address at Antioch College in 1859, he said, "Be ashamed to die until you've won some victory for humankind." Margaret Mead said that a handful of thoughtful, committed people can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that has. To know, to care, to act. Students must know. They must care, but they also must act. During the Nazi period in Germany, not enough people, it was a very knowledgeable society. They knew deeply, but not enough cared and acted. To act, to know, to care, and to act. Dante said that the worst place in hell is reserved for those who in times of great moral crisis take a neutral stand. Edmund Burke said that the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men and women to do nothing. We cannot be neutral in the difficult and challenging times in which we now live. If it were announced that there was a fire in this room, how many of us would sit here and be neutral? Martin Luther King Jr.'s life exemplified knowing, caring, and acting. When teaching about Martin Luther King's life, teachers need to go beyond King's dream speech and describe the tremendous controversy that surrounded his life. Both African Americans and white harshly criticized King for his position on the Vietnam War. It was okay for him to work for civil rights, but when he started opposing the war, people said that's too far. How did King respond? In one of his last speeches, he said, and I quote, "It is my deep conviction that justice is indivisible, that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. For those who tell me I'm hurting the civil rights movement and ask, don't you think that in order to be respected and in order to gain support, you must stop talking against the war?" I can only say that I'm not a consensus leader. I do not seek to determine what is right and wrong by taking a Gallup poll to determine majority opinion. And it is again my deep conviction that ultimately a genuine leader is not a searcher of consensus, but a molder of consensus. On some position, the coward asks the question, is it safe? Expediency asks the question, is it politic? Vanity asks the question, is it popular? But conscience must ask the question, is it right? And there comes a time when one must take a stand that is neither safe, nor politic, nor popular. But one must take it because it is right. And that is where I find myself today. King also said that we will live together as brothers and sisters, or die separate and apart as strangers. In 1971, James Baldwin, in an open letter to Angela Davis, stated why multicultural education is essential in a democratic and just nation and world. He wrote, "If we know, then we must fight for your life as though it were our own, which it is, and render impassable with our bodies the corridors to the gas chamber. For if they come for you in the morning, they will come for us that night." Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, Jim, thank you so very much. That was truly extraordinary and an obvious reflection of why your faculty colleagues have such high regard for you. And I think it's also adding a very nice note to what I'm very pleased to announce tonight, because there's something that is very special about this evening also, because I have the great pleasure of announcing that through the generous contributions of Washington Mutual and CEO of Washington Mutual, Kerry Killinger, and his wife, Linda Killinger, there's been created a $1 million new endowed chair in multicultural education in the College of Education. And the purpose of this endowed chair is to make sure that there is always a faculty member in the college whose research and teaching attends to the critical issues of diversity in K-12 education. But furthermore, I am delighted to announce that this evening's lecturer, Professor James Banks, is the first holder of the Kerry and Linda Killinger Endowed Chair in Diversity Studies. Congratulations, Jim. What a wonderful honor. And thank you, of course, to Washington Mutual and the Killingers, who unfortunately weren't able to be here tonight, for their wonderful generosity. We are delighted that they care so much about this critical issue and this wonderful, wonderful faculty member. Thank you all for being here tonight.